Well, that worked perfectly, as if on cue. Good evening, everybody. I'm Catherine Kluver. I'm the Executive Director of the Future of Diplomacy Project, proud co-sponsor of this evening's event. Before I let Professor Jim Sebenius talk you through the order of our events this evening, I just wanted to personally welcome all of you and just express my gratitude for this event. We have been long planning this. In fact, as is potentially my nature as a former journalist, we very much, as the Future of Diplomacy Project and the Program on Negotiation, were committed to bringing this to you first before HBO had the opportunity to actually premiere this film. And so this has been very much a labor of love, both for the Program on Negotiation and the Future of Diplomacy Project at the Kennedy School. Unfortunately, the Kennedy School decided to have a very light home improvement project, as those of you who are from the Kennedy School will know. We are in the midst of a 3-year construction project, which has sort of changed the entire physical infrastructure of the place, and in that sense made it impossible for us when we wanted to do this quite early. And to do this, in fact, before HBO. So with our wonderful partners whom we have had a partnership for the past 5 years, working first through our Great Negotiator series and now through our Secretary of State project, with the Program on Negotiation, we were able to give this film the rightful home, the rightful amplification, and of course, the substantial undergirding that these kind of discussions need to have when we screen things at a place like Harvard University. I was particularly vested in this film because not only do I share a birthday with Richard Holbrooke, but we share the same alma mater, which you will see comes up a number of times in the film. He was ambassador to my own country, Germany, and I feel very much changed really the face of the European continent in a way that means an incredible amount to my generation. So part of the reason that I was so invested in this is because I really felt that for my generation of specifically Europeans, but anyone who is vested in the future of American diplomacy, there could be no larger figure, no more impactful figure than Richard Holbrooke. And so that's why I'm thrilled to have this evening with all of you, to have this evening with Jim, who will ask pointed questions of David, and to have this engaging discussion with you after we screen the movie.
So, Catherine, thanks first for the introduction, and much more than that, for going to extraordinary lengths to make this happen. Now, of course, we arranged the massive construction project at the Kennedy School in order to give us the edge of actually putting on this show. But that's how you move the geopolitical chess pieces. Anyway, I'm Jim Sebenius, my home institution, and I'm a professor at Harvard Business School and director of the Harvard Negotiation Project. The reason I'm standing in front of you is partly because the Program on Negotiation with the Future of Diplomacy program is co-sponsoring this effort. But very specifically, we have a Great Negotiator Award that has been going since 2001. And in 2004, we unanimously voted to honor Richard Holbrooke, both for his work in ending the war in Bosnia and for less well-known, but in many ways as consequential work in the United Nations on bringing the U.S. up to speed so it was no longer in arrears to the UN, and that had a lot of far-reaching consequences. He's an extraordinary negotiator, and in the time that we spent in advance as well as during that the day that he was here, and both before and afterward, we learned a huge amount. And I think subsequently, the video clips and the insight that endless students and executive program participants and others have gotten from Dick Holbrooke's generous work here have been really extraordinary, and we're appreciative. So my job really is to get out of the way and introduce the filmmaker and, more importantly, son of Richard Holbrooke, David Holbrooke.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. And it's great to be here at Harvard. My father would love that. He went to Brown, in case you were wondering. But he would love to be here at Harvard. He would love that people are eating pizza and having popcorn to watch this movie about him. He would also love that this screen, in a way, is an effort at multilateralism. Kennedy School, the business school, and all of that. Look, I really made this film for three primary reasons. One, I felt my father had something more to say, which you'll see in the film. He really did, about the world we live in and about so much more. I felt my kids really needed to understand who their often absent grandfather was, and so you'll see them show up in the film. And I also wanted to inspire another generation of diplomats. And diplomacy matters now more than ever, something he certainly felt, but I think something that's kind of self-evident. And you'll see the very last line in the credits. The very, very last line is dedicated to the next generation of diplomats. And so he would have been thrilled that this is part of this school. Last night I was at Brown, where David Rode, a character you meet in the film, is teaching a class called Richard Holbrooke, The Rise and Fall of American Power. And so his story is reaching not only some of us who might remember Bosnia when it actually happened, or Vietnam, but younger people, and really inspiring them. For me, you know, as I say, this is my story of his life, and ultimately really a labor of love. And I hope you guys like the film. Jim and I will sit down afterwards, take your questions. I'll just forewarn, I don't know much about negotiation. I know a little something about diplomacy. But I'm a filmmaker, so just lower those expectations for a really... but I hope you enjoy the film. It's The Diplomat, and thanks so much for being here. We'll talk after. Hello, Jim. Thanks for watching.
Hello, David.
Hi, everybody. Golly.
And I have to tell you, this is a very busy time around the university. We're kind of mid-April. Exams and papers are due. This crowd is an extraordinary testament to the interest and regard that people hold to your father.
Well, it's appreciated, and to have so many people turn out really is quite something for film. By the way, it is on HBO, so you could just stay at home. But for all these people to come out, and it was funny, Susan Hackley shared with me earlier, my father, when he got the Great Negotiator Award, was October 27th, 2004, which seemed to coincide with a certain Red Sox game that night. And I was struck by the fact that you all were like, pick it up, let's get to this. We'll get you home by the third inning. So there's no baseball season's just starting, basketball season's over, playoffs haven't started, so let's settle
He was
in.
a student of local culture, and you don't mess with the Red Sox.
No, he understood. No, we would never do that. So again, thank you all.
No, this is really very remarkable. And I remember one of the things that he told us in conversation, which was when he was at Brown, and even later following many students who were friends of his in different universities and so forth, that really negotiation wasn't something that was taught or particularly of real interest. Oh. And he was actually thrilled to learn that even at the business school, for example, that like production and like marketing and like finance, students were then required to take negotiation. And of course, negotiation and diplomacy are so closely linked and in people's minds. I just want to mention a few things, and then really you're the person that I think most of us want to hear from. Catherine Kluver with the Future of Diplomacy Project, and I with the Harvard Negotiation Project and the Program on Negotiation, we have honored a large number now, since 2001, of women and men who've really done extraordinary things through negotiation and diplomacy, surmounting very high barriers that often defeated lots of other efforts to accomplish really worthwhile goals. And one of the things that your father, I think, when we told him that we had given him this award, he wanted to make sure this wasn't an honorific. I mean, yes, it was.
Sure.
And it was, but mainly we wanted to learn from him. And I think that's one of the things. We started with George Mitchell for his work in Northern Ireland, Charlene Barshevsky for some remarkable trade deals, Lakhdar Brahimi, who of course was instrumental early in Afghanistan and more recently in Syria.
Many friends of his.
Sure. And then your dad. And the process by which we carry out this great negotiator business, we write case studies in advance of whoever's coming on what seem like their most important negotiations. The price of admissions is really that you've read and debated these case studies before our honoree is there. And then it's a long grilling by students and faculty, just starting with put yourself in the situation of your most difficult negotiations. And what did you do? And why? And what worked, what didn't work? What, in retrospect, might you have done differently? How does this generalize to other situations? And, you know, the conversation proceeds this way. And he was so incisive.
I bet he was.
And so, you know, so many things that you saw that you brought out in the film. I mean, historically informed, enormously versatile if he needed to be. He thought of negotiation as jazz. You have a clear theme, but it's endless improvisation. And then sometimes negotiation is a campaign, carefully plotted out and methodically executed. And, you know, the view from the ground was essential. You just couldn't trust third parties. And, of course, everyone knows the force of personality and how he charmed at least most people. But
Not the President of the United States.
No, and that's and Karzai initially, and there were others. But I think people mostly recognize just how powerful, what an extraordinary asset that was. They focus on his personality, but I think when we dug in, we saw this is a man who has a strategic vision.
Very much so.
And zooms out to this kind of abstract vision and zooming in to the people with whom he was dealing, and that he never lost sight of the fact that this is a duality. And I think one of the most sort of fraught pieces of our conversation was he got a lot of criticism from many people for, quote, bombing and talking in Bosnia. And he defended it clearly. But when people pressed on the relationship between force and diplomacy, he immediately turned to Vietnam and said, that was a false assumption. It doesn't work. In fact, it's actually quite rare that this is the case. And let me play out some of the reasons. And of course, people were very interested in that. And he knew tough choices. I think that scene toward the end where he was saying, you know, we can end this war in Bosnia. It's an unjust peace. It's nowhere near where we would all like to be, but it's so much better than the alternatives. And to make those tough calls and to close a deal on that basis, really quite extraordinary and very willing to admit mistakes. I mean, what's interesting is, of course, we have lots of video clips of his answers to these tough questions. Sure. And just last semester, Bob Mnookin of the law school and Nick Burns, a distinguished diplomat in his own right from the Kennedy School.
Who worked in Dayton, of course. He was the spokesman for my father. Dayton.
Absolutely.
So it was the most boring job ever because he couldn't really talk to the press. They were sequestered beyond the Dayton Air Force Base. And he said it really wasn't much to do most days.
But, you know, you looked at this, and I mention this because we had a remarkable class of people across the university, including some diplomats, but mostly people in their 20s in graduate school. And if you looked at the Dayton issues, we put students exactly in his position. Then we showed video clips of his responses. People debated them. It was alive. And afterwards, you know, this highly interactive class discussion featuring the insights from your dad was actually one of the most popular classes. And that included some pretty great luminaries. Anyway, I wanted to give you a sense that he's a special guy around here for reasons that may not be as obvious in other places. And someone else who's really, really smart and has a pretty big personality was president of Harvard at the time. That would be Larry Summers. And Larry, who presided over the dinner honoring Holbrooke, it was such a heartfelt tribute. There was a sense of, you know, Dick Holbrooke is a model public servant. He is not there to be something or to hold an office. He's there to do good things. And he did do good things.
And I think, I read this, thanks for Susan sharing this with me, and he said that, though, as impressive as the many different roles Richard Holbrooke has held, that this is not 1/10 as impressive as what Richard Holbrooke has done in the various jobs he has had. And I think that the Kennedy Center obituary, the memorial that opens the film, I remember President Clinton getting up there and saying, you know, for those who didn't get Holbrooke, who didn't understand, what they didn't understand was what he could do. And what he was doing at the time, what President Clinton was doing, which I didn't understand because I was in my own place of mourning and trying to say, okay, what do I say to the Kennedy Center audience? But he was basically taking a jab at his successor, at President Obama, who clearly didn't get him. And it was quite something for a former president to say to a sitting president. And it was, as Mark Leibovich described in his book, This Town, it was funereal jujitsu, I think is what he called it, which was fascinating to see because, you know, that there was this feeling in the Clinton camp that the Obama people never got him. And I think that was true, certainly by my reporting.
You know, if you move back to some very tough negotiations, everyone can picture sort of mano a mano with Slobodan Milosevic, and people, you know, are focused on that big personality opposite the strongman, and yet some of his toughest negotiations were internal. So when he was trying to get the U.S. to pay up its dues and get the UN to reform its dues system, he had to deal directly with Jesse Helms, who was a senator and widely known as a bitter enemy of the United Nations. How did he deal with him?
Well, he dealt with it by considering, you know, it was what he says earlier in the film, you start out by defining the national interest, and then figure out what the parties want. And I think he understood that with Helms, and he was being held up. He was been nominated to be the ambassador to the UN, but was being held up in all these partisan wars. And my father was caught in the crossfire. And so what had happened was Helms was holding this big hearing, finally, that they were going to actually have a hearing to try and confirm him. But it was no sure thing by any means. And so he knew Helms was sort of loaded for bear and gunning for him. So he did this very clever thing, which he said to me. I was my now wife, then fiance, had a daughter from a previous marriage who was about 4 at the time, and he said, bring her to the hearing, dress her up, make her look cute, which wasn't hard for a 4-year-old girl, and we showed up, and so Senator Helms came wheeling in a little bit like Dr. Evil and Austin Powers. That wasn't fair. Okay. So he wheels in.
You're on safe ground here.
He says, and you can tell it's game time. This is going to go. And my father says, Senator, I want you to meet my son and his wife, which was a little bit of a lie since we were going to get married later that year. But I don't think the senator would have approved of us living in sin. And he said, and their daughter. And Bibi, who's now a sophomore at Brown, just looked up and smiled and beamed and did all the things that she was supposed to do. And Jesse Helms melted. His whole countenance, everything changed about Jesse Helms. And my father later said that my now stepdaughter saved his career in public service. But it was smart. He understood what was going to be a trigger for Helms. And later we got, for our subsequent children, got these nice plates from Senator and Mrs. Helms who would congratulate us on the birth of our newest child. But he understood that, and he understood that as a person and who he, what would move Helms. And I think there was also some, the program on negotiation, this idea of what are some of the basics. And of course he understood that. And one of my favorite stories on negotiation with him, as you saw in the film, he knew Robert De Niro fairly, not as well as one might know Robert De Niro, but they were certainly friends. And at some point, the New York actors were having a big fight with the Producers Guild, and it was a big work stoppage, and there were all these issues. And so De Niro said, "My father, will you come talk to the actors and give us some tips on how to do this?" He said, "Of course." So he walks in. There's Harvey Keitel and Tim Robbins and Susan Sarandon and all these iconic New York actors, and so he sat down with them and said, "Okay, this is what you do, this is what you do." And so I asked, I said, "Well, how'd it go?" He goes, "Well, I gave him these tips." And I said, how's it going to go for them? He goes, "Oh, they're going to get slaughtered. They don't have a chance. They're completely clueless about this kind of thing, and the producer's going to eat them alive," which I don't know, ultimately knew the result, but I think that was his take on it. But I love that they were bringing him in as a negotiator to go see how they could get better contracts.
Suggests good judgment.
Yeah, exactly.
So one of the things I loved about how you framed this film was that you really didn't know him very well as a father in a lot of the ways that many children do. And this film was your way, after his death, of getting to know really who he was. And it's clear the film itself says so much about who he was and what you learned. But you've now showed this film to a lot of people.
Sure.
And had conversations and so forth. And I'm curious, what are a few of the things that you've learned about your dad having done this film and talked with people afterwards?
Sure. I think, understanding him as a person is one thing. I mean, reading the letters he wrote to my mom when he was courting her in his own odd way were one thing, but it was also spending time with the people around him who knew him and spent a lot more time with him than I did. Well, people always want a personal answer, and I always feel like I kind of gave with the movie on the personal stuff. What I really took away a lot was how bloody hard diplomacy is, and how many things have to go right for Dayton Accords to happen, to have the Iran deal in Vienna last summer. All these things there's so many incredible forces working against this, and that a diplomat is able to navigate these treacherous waters still blows me away. And that to dive into what he did was revelatory to me. And also to spend time to go to Srebrenica on the anniversary we went in 2013, so the 18th anniversary of the slaughter there, and go to the memorial there, and you see a little bit of it in the film, but what was happening there was incredible, and basically he understood. He came in, I think, 2004 or 5 to, I think it's Porocari it's called, which is a battery factory not far from Srebrenica, where a lot of the slaughter took place. And across the way from this is a cornfield, just a big cornfield with corn. And he looked and he said to the people there, "This is going to be a memorial and cemetery for Srebrenica." And they said, "No, it's a cornfield." He said, "No, this is going to be this thing," and it is. And for him to be able to see that, it was that vision of also knowing, that in transitional justice and all these other complicated things, that this was pivotal. And I think for me, really understanding, I knew the headlines, I'd read his book, I had paid attention to what he was doing, but to really dive in deeper and to spend all this time with Roger Cohen or Chris Hill or Wes Clark or Dexter Filkins, there's a character, what a great guy he is, to be in Afghanistan with him and understand all these countervailing forces that are working against him to do his job. And again, this was so helpful, Susan, thank you for sharing this with me. And he said, this was at Harvard, and now this award honors the art of negotiation. I say art deliberately because it is not a science and never will be. It is, as I've said many times, like jazz, negotiations and improvisation on a theme. You know where you want to go, but you surely don't know how to get there. And it's not linear. You don't just list the 15 problems and work your way through them. You have to jump from number 1 to 6 and back to 4. You have to give up on one and set another aside. And in complicated negotiations, the traditional line, quote, "Nothing is actually finally agreed to until everything is agreed to," means that people reserve the right to kill the deals, as we've seen time and again, such as the 2000 negotiations in Camp David in the Mideast. Wow, how does it get done? I mean, Catherine, this is your world, and it still amazes me. And to me, that, what I should have learned was like, he really wanted to be a dad, but that's my answer. And I think it's really important to understanding this craft.
It's interesting because he firmly refused to give us his principles of negotiation. However, he gave us very clear principles of negotiation.
Yeah.
For example, he talked, the persistence is really something, and that's something that we've seen with virtually all of the great negotiators. At a place like Harvard, there's a real premium on how do you sort of crack the problem intellectually, and the blinding insight that sort of lays it open. And there were those, but the slog, and the sort of intelligent slog, and what you might say, thinking strategically but acting highly opportunistically, and giving an awfully large role to luck and chance. And these things, are good things to carry with you when you take on problems of this kind.
And I think that's right. Jim Johnson, the guy in the purple sweater in the film, he says, that he had this ability to see the both the forest and the trees. And I'm not sure, a lot of other great negotiators, a lot of other great diplomats had that ability. And it was both the vision, but the execution, the ability to say, okay, what's happening next? And even though he was, flying at whatever altitude he was flying at, the details, the devil is in the details. And that mattered so much to him. And if you read To End a War, he was diving in telephone exchanges, currency, police forces, all these things that were, might seem picayune to somebody else, but to him were essential, because if you didn't have that groundwork, it was going to be a problem. In Afghanistan, or actually in Pakistan, some people there call them Ambassador Pomegranate. Catchy. And the reason was because he cared about if farmers are growing pomegranates, less likely to grow opium. But he wasn't just like, oh, there's something. He wanted to understand if pomegranates could actually work. He wanted to understand the soil, the water. He wanted to know all these details. And I think that was really important to him. And I think another big facet, which he talks about in this and in general, was his team. That was hugely important to him. Nick Burns was a big part of that. But in Afghanistan, in the SRAP office, he loved that team. He loved those people, and he believed that that would give him the flexibility to cover all bases, as it were. And he had somebody from Homeland Security on his team. He had somebody from agriculture. He had somebody from defense, all these different people. Homeland Security was when a Pakistani general is coming to D.C., and said, if I'm given basically the rubber glove treatment when I land, I'm going to go turn around and go home. And so my father sent his Homeland Security guy to make sure he gets through there. He was looking at this for all possibilities, and he also wanted the 360 sensibility of what could they tell him. And as Vali Nasser told me, he'd write a memo, and it would end up in the president's desk with Vali's name still on it. And my father was, widely ridiculed isn't the right word, but he was known for his ego. He was known for his aggressiveness, his ambition, all these things. But he was also, he was a team leader, and the operative word being team.
When you look at a man like him in the roles that he played, he was the principal soloist and the conductor, but he needed and knew he needed and deeply inspired a skilled ensemble. And the loyalty that these people felt was remarkable. And he never missed an opportunity. For example, the 3 men who were killed on Mount Igman,
right.
To praise them, to remember them. It was, and I think that was emblematic of the people who were there.
Well, that was seared into his consciousness.
But negotiation was a team sport.
That's
and
right.
All these things you sort of hear and you experience with someone like this, and you don't forget them. If you have this notion of, striped pants and, and cables, and that's what diplomacy is, Holbrooke just blows up that conception. So much more active and focused on really doing good.
That's right, and I think it's also, he has a great line in the beginning when he's talking about Vietnam, that when we send our young men and women overseas to fight, we have to be clear about what the objective is. And I'm, he makes that speech in the fall of 2010, about 2 months before he dies. Henry Kissinger is there, was a State Department historians conference on Vietnam, and it's clear to me he's really talking about Afghanistan. That what he is saying is, this is what we don't have in Afghanistan. And by the way, 5 years after his death, we still don't. And I think that's, he couldn't necessarily, I don't think he would have, gotten us out of Afghanistan in a way that we would call successful, but it's hard for me to imagine it being worse. And I look at the administration today and can't begin to understand, as a layperson, again, lower the expectations of me as having a deep dive into diplomacy, but just reading the New York Times or looking at other sources, I don't begin to see anybody explaining what our strategy is there. And to me, that's what he was almost best at. Envisioning it, articulating it, and executing it. And the real tragedy to me of the third act is he was never allowed to do that. And the reason to me that he wasn't allowed to wasn't because he had bad ideas. It was because the President of the United States didn't like him. the President of the United States is the President of the United States and should, you know, if he doesn't like you, that's one thing, but to keep him on and to keep my father sort of twisty in the wind, as it were,
and figure out really how to use his unique talents. That's a loss.
And they couldn't.
That's a loss.
They couldn't, and it really came down, you know, to personality and you know, the Richard Dick thing that we have in the film. It was also, he'd been a Hillary partisan, but he was also very careful. Never, when he was a surrogate in the bitter primary of 2008, never to say, you know, he spoke highly of Hillary, but never trashed Obama. He was very careful about that because he respected him and all of that. And despite his problems with the president, everybody I talked to, from Les Gelb to Kati to staff members, said if somebody in the staff said, well, the president's really screwing us on this, or said something, he cut them off. And he wouldn't abide by any conversation that was disrespectful. You know, strategically, and how do you approach that, of course, but he really was, in the end, a word that we don't use in the film, was an enormous patriot. And had so much respect for the commander-in-chief and for the office and for this president who didn't show him the same respect back.
David, we have perhaps 10 minutes, and I'd love to get questions from the audience.
Yeah.
What I'd ask people to do is state your name, please, and secondly, to say and ask your question briefly, and questions we'll ask to end with a question mark. So let me start. You had a question here. Let me ask you if you can come forward with the mic.
Hi, Mark Manley. Thank you very much, David, for sharing your dad's great story. One of the first quotes you have from your dad is, "Life is risky. Take risks. Don't be reckless." So later, he says, "What trouble can I cause?" To what extent do those themes play out in your life and work?
Not in the same way they did in his, you know, but I look at it more. I'm a skier, and I live in Telluride, Colorado, and I do some things that I think a lot of normal people would sort of look and say, wow, you're kind of exposed there in terms of being on a, but very different. And I do think, you know, making this film, taking my daughter to Afghanistan when she was 18 was not a universally loved decision in my family. And I did it because she bloody insisted, and she said, look, I've got to go, and if I don't go with you, I'll never go. And she also said, I've been working a lot as a barista and a babysitter, and I've got a ton of money. She'd taken a gap year, and I'll pay for my trip. And that persistence I really respected. My wife just kept, like, there was no news going on in the world while we were there. My wife's friends would be like, oh, did you see there's another bombing in Kabul? And blah, 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 blah. And, but I do think, and I think about it a lot, especially if I'm doing something stupid in the mountains or something risky versus reckless. But, you know, and he was that way. He was, Roger Cohen wrote this terrific piece about him after Dayton and talking about him skiing. He was actually, the irony is he was quite reckless on a ski slip. You never wanted to be below him. I saw him knock over all kinds of people, and it was just a dangerous place to be. But I think for my own life, you know, this film was the most risky thing I did. And I had a lot of friends when I first started doing this, and friends would say to me, wow, that's brave of you. And I just never saw it that way. But then I started to understand, it was really after it was done and it turned out all right, that people looked differently. And they said, wow, you really took this on, and it could have gone spectacularly bad. It really could have, and I never thought that. But it was key, and just like my father assembled a great team and, you know, really was trying to say, okay, how can I honor him that way? But if I had screwed it up, it would have been really bad on a number of levels. So, thank you, sir. You got a bunch.
Yes, just behind you.
Kai Morgenstern. I have a quick question. You interviewed a lot of people who are very important public people, and I wonder how much more information you got as a proper or more blunt feedback, personal feedback, which you could not use within the film you made.
Sure. We interviewed 75 people. We asked President Obama, Vice President Biden for interviews, and neither of them said yes. I think there were a handful. President Carter wasn't able to. Admiral Mullen, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who he feuded with a lot, and that was important to me, was to get to the people who didn't like him. The Doug Lute thing. I'm always be grateful to Doug Lute for speaking to me, and strangely enough, when we were setting up this interview, his office said, "Well, the ambassador would like to know what you and your producer are doing for dinner tonight after the shoot." And we were in Belgium, and we don't really have plans. And would you like to stay over at Truman Hall? And it was really, going to Lions Den, the Lion saying, welcome. You want a beer? Literally, and I remember I did this interview with him, and we had been traveling, and for some reason we had, running around, and I had barely eaten going into this interview, and was broiling hot in Europe that week. And so after the interview, Doug Lute said at some point, he wanted to tell me something, but he didn't want to say it on camera. And that happened a couple of times. What was striking to me was how those comments, including Lute's, were relatively banal. They want to stop the whole production down, and what they tell me never was that interesting or that something that I would use. And I think especially Frank Wisner did that. And he was an old friend of my father's. I think there was an old school sensibility in a way that he wanted to be discreet. With Lute afterwards, I said, "Let's do this, Ambassador. Let's keep rolling, and then we'll talk about it afterwards." He said, "Well, we'll do that over beer." And I said, "Sounds great. I love beer." And then I had one of these Belgian beers with him on an empty stomach, and I'm just like, "Oh, this is great." We have a ton of material, and I think it'll be great for George Packer. It's writing a biography about him. I think that could be helpful, some background, and also, at some point, for his papers, wherever they end up, whether it's at Brown or someplace. But people were, not surprisingly, but awfully candid with me, and I think to see Secretary Clinton, and the thing I get a lot about this film is how people have never seen her like this. And I really feel, people say, well, you should be doing her videos. You should be out with her because clearly she has a comfort level with you. And I think it was the subject. But I do think, you see this, you don't feel she's being, her answers are poll tested. You don't feel her answers are guarded, and you feel her struggle as someone, that her boss and her colleague can't work this out, and she's in the middle of this negotiation in a way. I do think some of those photos, especially that one of her, my father, the president, the vice president, and her far away, her 100-mile stare is remarkable. And I felt for her. But people were incredibly gracious with their time. And the key to me in the film was really, I knew early that I had to go to these places that he had gone to. That was such a big part of his story. And then it was, okay, if I just go there and walk around, that's going to be stupid. And so getting Roger Cohen, and he was the first one to do it, bless his heart, to come to Sarajevo. And then General Clark came along. And then, we got Dexter to fly for basically 2 days all the way to Kabul and turn around. But people were really, they wanted to talk about him. He had a big impact on their lives. And Dexter told me a great story where he had said, and we tried to work in the film, it just didn't quite make it, but Dexter he was covering that first trip with Admiral Mullen, my father. They were going February 2009, going around to Pakistan and Afghanistan. It was this road show, basically, and Dexter said it was going great. And Dexter had written something that he knew was right, but that didn't make things look particularly good for the Americans. And so my father froze him, just said, I'm not going to talk to you anymore, did it publicly, and kind of crapped on him in front of all these people. And Dexter's thinking, oh, it's been going so well, what happened? And then one of my father's staff says to Dexter, go meet the ambassador. See that door down there, the one that says bathroom? Go in there, he's waiting for you. Dexter's like, was this out of a movie? And so he goes in.
Was it the men's room?
It was. Excellent question. You never know. He was only going to follow Hillary in there, but yes. So he's in the men's room, and he's standing at the urinal, never looks at Dexter. Dexter goes, Ambassador Holbrooke. He said, yes. He goes, Dexter, what you wrote about is true. He said, but I can't talk about it. He said, however, if you follow this, and I don't remember the specific, but if you follow this lead, it will take you other places into this. And Dexter wrote, and he said, basically it was something really out of John le Carre. This conversation in the men's room in Pakistan never happened. And Dexter backed his way out of there and was out the door. And he said it was right. And I think that also goes to something that we don't really go into the film, but you can see the affection of Cohen, of Klein, of Dexter, of Packer, that my father was unique to them. There was no government official that was going to talk to them in the same way. That he wanted to be a journalist was so important, and he got a lot of grief. And I, of course, just sort of furthered that with this idea of him being a leaker. But it was a two-way street, and what he really understood, and you see it really with David Rode. He understood that journalists were serious, that they were on the ground, that they understood the landscape. And that went back to his friendship with David Halberstam in 1964, when David's 25 years old and writing front-page stories blasting the government on their policy in Vietnam and being right. And then the big shots come in and don't get the story because they're traveling along with McNamara, who, as Packer says, doesn't even know what questions to ask. But yeah, his relationship with journalists was really something. And it was, I think, a real mutually beneficial relationship.
And he himself was a journalist.
He was a great writer.
Both from his college days, and then he was editor of Foreign Policy.
Yeah.
And I think he understood something that's taken a lot of people who think of diplomacy as important people in a small room, cutting deals. In fact, the public nature of diplomacy, and I'm not really talking about public diplomacy, but I'm talking about the importance of shaping the views of different constituencies, is probably more important in many respects than what's actually said in a, kind of at the table. And he was both of those things.
I think that's right. I'll tell quickly that story I told at dinner about Malcolm X. He was editor of the Brown Daily Herald, and he...
Not Malcolm X.
Malcolm X was not editor. No, that's just thank you for... Malcolm X had... the Brown Daily Herald, which my father was editing, had written an article about Malcolm X, and I guess his Google alert or something went off, and he saw that he had been written about, and not favorably, in the Brown Daily Herald. So my father got this call from an unhappy Malcolm X, and this is 1961, I think, and so, different set of 60s, and he gets this call, and Malcolm X says, I want to come to campus and respond to your scurrilous article. And my father says, great, this will be terrific. And the Brown administration has no interest in this, none at all. And they say they're going to shut this down. And instead, my father said, well, that's fine. Then we'll take this event off campus and say to people that Brown University does not support freedom of speech. And so there's a terrific NPR piece. If you look up Holbrooke, Malcolm X, NPR, there's a terrific piece where you hear his voice and talking about this, and he basically negotiated. He stared down at the age of 19 the administration, Brown, which was quite fierce as whatever year he was.
Well, I have a feeling that a number of people may want to sit and chat. This has been a remarkable couple of hours that we've spent with the film and with you. Maybe one last question, and then what I'll do is suggest that as long as people want to stick around informally, we can do so. Tom.
Tom Ashbrook with NPR.
Okay.
And so great to have you here.
Pleasure, Tom. Thank you.
And I'm sure I speak for a lot of people in this room, having just stared at your father for a couple of hours. The way he is in your face is quite remarkable, and I'm sure you know
weird,
that.
Yeah. But that NPR thing, quickly, that I never thought I sounded like him, and then when I played that, and this was him at 20,
You do.
It flipped me out. I couldn't believe in this particular thing I sound so much like him. It was really
I also just wanted to observe that as much as we saw the power of your father as a bulldozer, this is a great film.
Thank you.
And I think the strength of it comes from your set of strengths, which is different but terribly strong, which seem to be humanity and listening and observing very carefully. I'm sure you share a lot of that with him, but at the humanity end, away from the bulldozer end, there's also power, and I think you show it in this film. My question is, do you think that your father, if he had had the support of the White House, could have found a solution in Afghanistan with his older school set of values and approaches? Or is it possible that beyond their personality clash, which you show vividly with your nice editing here, that Obama was onto something that your father wasn't? Do you think he could have found a way? Or did Obama see something that your dad didn't?
If President Obama saw something my father didn't, we would have seen it by now. You know, here we are. And look, Bob Woodward in 2010 releases this book that's called Obama's War. And that might have been a little premature then. Now in 2016. It's his war, and while I think he's handled it better than his predecessor, that was a pretty low bar. And I look at it and think, yeah, having been over there, having spent time with the people who worked with him, and they tell me, Rina Amiri, the lovely Afghan woman who you see in the film, or Vali, or any of these people are heartbroken by what's going on now, and they say he would be as well. And I think there is a real like I said, a lack of vision, a lack of strategy, and you look, you know, this is Harvard and international, all this stuff. If anybody cannot explain to me what the U.S. policy is in Afghanistan now, I'd love to understand it, but it's a mess. And 20 Afghan police recruits killed yesterday. They said one of the few bright spots in the economy is the telecom business, and that's going south. And the power sharing agreement's a mess. And by the way, I give a lot of credit to President Obama and Secretary Kerry, and I think my father would have been a better fit with the president in the second term. I think the president came into his own. He came, he and his team, Dennis McDonough, the current chief of staff, they were the foreign policy guys, and they didn't have the experience, they didn't have the vision, and they didn't have the willingness to listen to diplomats. And those pictures of all the generals and all of that are very powerful and I think very real. But I do feel that the president, whether it's in Myanmar, Cuba, certainly, or the Iran deal, as flawed as it will be, as it is still an act of diplomacy and a real achievement, a game changer, as we all know. And he couldn't have done that in his first term, and my father would have been, pushing him. It was a bad mix. And the thing to me again is it came down to personality. It wasn't that the president and my father were on opposite ends policy-wise. It was that they just couldn't connect, and generational, various other things, but. That's a real tragedy, and not just for me or for my family, but I think for America and for the young men and women who are still over there. I got having a film on HBO, a lot of people come out of the woodwork, and a lot of people who, old friends and all of that, which has been wonderful. But I got a really memorable letter from a man who said, my name's Quentin Proul, and he said, I watched your film, and it upset me greatly, because I feel that if the president had listened to your father instead of, these are his words, those arrogant generals. He said, I feel my son wouldn't have come home from fighting in the 12th Battalion completely shattered. And he said, I just hope that he'll learn that lesson. And to me, that's where we're at. Here we are, all this time, all this energy, money, but most of all, lives. And for what? And more importantly, where are we? And Catherine, what's the future? And ultimately, the future is a diplomatic solution. And the idea that, General Petraeus felt that reconciliation, back then was, as he said to my father, a 15-second conversation. And the military solution was always going to be trouble. And I think the most important line to me in the film is Strobe Talbot's in the second act in Bosnia, when he says, the saying in the administration was, it's diplomacy backed by force. Diplomacy backed by force. And Vietnam was a mess. Afghanistan was the day of the generals. But in Bosnia, it worked. And it worked not flawlessly by any means. My father was the first to say, and if he were alive today, he would certainly say, reopen Dayton, dismantle Dayton. I actually wrote an op-ed when the film came out, and around the anniversary, the 20th anniversary, saying exactly that. And his greatest legacy needs to be restructured, because what's happening in Bosnia is disturbing. There was the conviction and the sentencing of Karadzic, thank God, but another war criminal went free. Cecil, I forgot, I'm not good with his name, but another one who was clearly a war criminal, and he's going into politics in Serbia. And so let's just imagine this situation now. If this goes sideways with a Russia that was completely quiet and largely dormant in 1995, imagine that tinderbox today and what will happen. And so, you know, diplomacy backed by force, and one of the things I've really hope a future administration, whoever it is, but if it is Hillary Clinton, I do believe she understands what happened there 20 years ago, and I think a little from the Clintons would go a long way towards re-examining, reopening, and bolstering that very, as I say, you know, tenuous agreement.
You know, David, if I think about what we've got here, your dad has so much to teach us, and it's interesting because he never saw diplomacy and force as opposites.
No.
He saw them as complements, but very subtle and complex. There's a lot we can learn directly from him. At the same time, you know, one of the telling points in the film was he had a budget of $300 million a year.
Amazing, huh?
When the Pentagon is spending $2 billion a week, and we ask, you know, is this really the right emphasis? And those questions are key. At the same time, your film, you know, there's a lot we can learn directly from close study and from his generous giving of his insights and so forth, but your film's going to inspire a lot. And I think that, you know, the emphasis and interest in diplomacy and negotiation is very high, and something like this is going to really boost it. So we're really in your debt, not just for tonight, but for something that can endure and inspire.
I appreciate it, and I've really seen it showing the film in universities all over the place, that people come up to me afterwards, and I can see it. You know, I showed it at Princeton, and two very interesting conversations. One with a young woman who said that being at Princeton is sort of she came into Princeton full of public service, wanted to take the Foreign Service exam, and she said Princeton, though, is such a quick road to Wall Street. And that's what happens, not to slag another Ivy, but she said that's what happened. She said that watching the film inspired her. And this is a very impressive, you know, 21-year-old woman. And then I had a conversation with a guy. We had dinner after we showed the film with a guy, an Army major, who's taken a 2-year fellowship at Princeton, tours in Iraq, tours in Afghanistan, and now he was living with his family in Princeton. And he said it fundamentally reshaped the way, this film had fundamentally reshaped the way he looked at the military's role. He said that he always believed in the primacy of the military, but you know, that's what he had dedicated his life to, but he had never seen it as diplomacy backed by force. And
diplomacy backed by force, and the tight relationship between war and politics and political ends. David, I hate to stop here, but we're really in your debt. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you all. I appreciate that.